Good evening. Welcome to the Rami Makhzoumi Chair in Corporate Governance, first in a series of lectures that we're holding tonight. Thanks to the Makhzoumi family, OSB was a pioneer in establishing the first of a kind, the Rami Makhzoumi Chair in Corporate Governance at the Olayan School of Business at the American University of Beirut, among the region's business schools. The chair's vision is to elevate corporate governance, education, awareness, and practice in the region and lift them to the international best practices. The chair is devoted to the dissemination of governance knowledge and research by way of closely exposing leaders to solid experience and tangible experience of good and bad governance, thus unveiling the motives for governance adoption among regional companies. The chair thus aims at putting the academic theory and findings of extensive research to the best use by being carried through to practical applications and implementation of governance among companies in the region. Before I know you are anxious to hear our keynote speaker, Ms. Teresa Barger, let me introduce our new leader, our dean, Dr. Wilfred van Honecker, an academic game changer on an international scale. That's how President Dorman calls him. A globally recognized scholar in marketing sciences and emerging markets, especially China. He has vast international experience acquired through academic appointments in Russia, China, the United States, France, and the MENA region. In Moscow, he established the acclaimed MBA and EMBA programs, a strategic partnership with MIT Sloan, an alliance with leading private business schools in Brazil, China, and India. Prior to Skolovo, he served as chair, professor of marketing, department head, and executive director of the Center for Marketing and Distribution at the School of Business and Management at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology in Hong Kong, where he is credited with establishing one of the top academic research departments in the world. He is the co-founder, former dean, and vice president of the China-Europe International Business School in Shanghai, a former professor of marketing at INSEAD, and a former professor of business at Columbia University's Graduate School of Business in New York. As one of only a few scholars with extensive expertise in China's growing economy, economic influence, he is a sought-after speaker, lecturer, and a commentator, appearing at conferences in classrooms and across media worldwide. He's the author of the China Casebook, the Asia Marketing Casebook, as well as numerous articles on consumer choice behavior, emerging market entry strategies, and the globalization of Chinese enterprises for publications such as the Harvard Business Review, the China Business Review, the Journal of Marketing Research, Marketing Science, and Management Science. Dr. Wilfred van Honecker.
Thank you very much, Hassan. This was short and sweet. It's a real honor to be here, actually, and I'm really very much looking forward to working with all of you to really put this business school and the university on the map. And I hope that, I would like to meet all of you, and this is an open invitation to work together to really, with the support of the Makhzoumi family, of course, really do something great in this part of the world. Let me welcome all of you. I'm not sure yet what the proper protocol is, whether I should welcome you to AUB and then welcome you at OSB, or first OSB and then AUB. But since I'm representing, I'm going to be the dean of the business school, and we are in the business school, this wonderful building. I would really like to extend a warm welcome, first of all, to Mr. and Mrs. Makhzoumi, and to this lecture series. We had this afternoon, unfortunately, not many of you were invited, but we had a closed door with some very senior chairmen, a session on corporate governance and boardroom behavior and what these issues are. And I think this very much leads into what I think, Rami stood for, what the Makhzoumi family stands for, and certainly an area of expertise and, values that this particular business school that I will be leading stands for. So a warm welcome to all of you. This is your school, this is your project. Come and join us, and we are going to do great things together. And with that, I'll give the floor to Hassan, who is going to introduce the speaker. So, thank you.
Before I introduce our keynote speaker, I just would like to note that there is a movie showing Rami's journey after the keynote speech. So please be patient. After Teresa finishes her talk, we are going to show a movie about Rami's journey, whose book is celebrating his life, is outside. Ms. Teresa Barger is the managing director and the CEO of Karteka Capital, an alternative asset manager focused exclusively on emerging markets and pursuing an active ownership strategy in the listed markets. In 2004, Ms. Barger established the IFC World Bank Corporate Governance and Capital Market Advisory Department and served as its first director till 2007. She was responsible for the corporate governance aspects of IFC investments in companies in the emerging markets. She also created the innovative GEMLOC Bond Fund Index and Market Development Program for local currency bonds. Prior to that, Ms. Barger set up the Private Equity and Investment Funds department at IFC. As a director of this department, Ms. Barger managed the largest portfolio of emerging markets investment funds in the world. She pioneered the creation of the first benchmarks for emerging markets, private equity, and co-founded the Emerging Markets Private Equity Association. Ms. Barger also developed the first 2 corporate governance funds in the emerging markets for both Korea and Brazil. During the more than 20 years career at IFC, Ms. Barger made investments in nearly every region of the emerging markets. She was, during the 1990s, managing the emerging market and the emerging and frontier market indices established by IFC. Before joining IFC, Ms. Barger was with McKinsey & Co., got her first degree from Harvard and her MBA from Yale School of Management. And actually, she did her postdoc work in Arabic at the American University in Cairo. Ms. Barger is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and she serves as a trustee of the Victory family of mutual funds and on the boards of Emerging Markets Private Equity Association. She also serves on the Private Sector Advisory Group of the Global Corporate Governance Forum and the Advisory Council of the Pacific Pension Institute. In fact, she was born in this region. She was born and raised in the eastern province of Saudi Arabia, where her father was with the first team who discovered the oil in the kingdom. Ms. Teresa, floor is yours.
President Dorman, Provost Dalal, Dean von Honecker, and Dr. Safieddine, thank you for the kind introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, Sayyadati wa Sadati, it is an honor to be asked to give the first Rami Makhzoumi lecture here at AUB. And it is a pleasure to meet Fouad and May Makhzoumi, who have generously turned their heartbreaking loss into something so positive for the region by endowing a chair in their late son's name. Like Rami, I was also born in Saudi Arabia, as Azam said. And while growing up in the dusty eastern province, Lebanon was our paradise, and AUB was the shining exemplar of all that was great and good about Lebanon. AUB was and still is known and appreciated for its culture of excellence and for the persistence of that culture among its far-flung graduates. And speaking of culture, it is a well-known fact that culture shapes policy. That is to say that a nation's culture is viewed like the soil in a vineyard, a constant base. And policy is like the vine that is nurtured by the soil, and so is invariably a product of that soil. Not a day goes by that I don't hear some formulation of this old saw. Everyone knows that culture is destiny, and that culture is translated into policy in both democratic and authoritarian governments. As Max Weber, the father of modern sociology, said, culture makes all the difference. For example, we all know that Americans are risk takers. The adventure-seeking members of families left their home countries and their villages to come to create what is America. So, of course, it follows that U.S. has policies that make it easy to set up new businesses, to take businesses bankrupt, and to get venture financing. Russians, we all know, need a strong man to lead them. This was true under the Tsars, and it is true today. Africans have large extended families that share any wealth created, thereby discouraging the accumulation of productive capital. Latin Americans have a mañana mentality, so will never be highly productive. The Chinese will always favor education because when a child is born, they take the first hairs from his head and make that into his first calligraphy brush. Are these things true? Perhaps some are descriptively true, much like a photograph is true. But culture is dynamic, more like a film in the cinema. But still photographs are, in some way, misleading. As investors, as policymakers, and as academics, we are more interested in the movie. We are more interested in the dynamic that causes a snapshot to be true or false, and the dynamic that will take it on a future trajectory. In the 1940s and 50s, the academic community was quite enamored of the topic of how culture affects economic development. And then interest faded. Discussion of the explanatory power of culture perked up again in the 1980s, perhaps because some divergences were revealed. For example, Ghana and Korea had very similar economic indicators in the 1960s. But by the 1980s, Korea was becoming an Asian tiger and a manufacturing powerhouse. This was, the thinking goes, because Koreans are hardworking, disciplined, thrifty, organized, and education-obsessed, and presumably the people of Ghana were not. There were also side-by-side comparisons of country pairs whose development diverged greatly from a similar starting point. Lawrence Harrison studied divergent development in Argentina versus Australia, the Dominican Republic versus Haiti, and concluded that it was culture that made the difference between success and failure. Indeed, the title of his book, Development is a State of Mind, nicely captured his thesis and also suggested the near impossibility of national economic life becoming free of the national state of mind. So, everyone knows that culture is a solid base and is the soil from which policy springs. That is, in my view, a pretty banal and maybe even boring proposition. And what is worse, I would argue, it's not terribly useful. The more important and to perhaps some threatening question is this: can policy change culture? I would say, of course it can. So first one must ask, what is culture? From the world of sociology, we know that culture is a set of values, behaviors, practices, symbols, and beliefs that are broadly held and are handed down from one generation to another and are reinforced by one's community. Of course, culture and the forces that develop a culture are hugely complex and difficult to understand and don't change easily. I fully agree that any short discussion of culture will be necessarily simplified and never give full due to its tangled roots. But I would posit that policies, procedures, regulations, and the incentives embedded in them can change behavior. When a group gets used to certain behaviors, they become habits, and from repetitive reinforcement, these can feed collectively into what we call culture. To use an example many people in Lebanon in the last few days have cited to me, there used to be a culture of stopping at red lights in Beirut. This was apparently destroyed to some degree by the Civil War, and it appears that it's taken some time for Beirut drivers to get back into this habit. That's just what I'm told. I would like to make the argument that policy at both the national level and the corporation level can change culture and change it powerfully. So how and why does this work? Most often a society adopts policy that has the power to change culture when some or all of three things occur. Number one, there is an external shock or a major external push, positive or negative. Often the trigger is a trauma, but sometimes it is simply an opportunity too good to pass up. We note that two countries with highly militaristic cultures suffered huge traumas in World War II, and then in the post-war period became the most pacifistic nations we have, Germany and Japan. Competitive threat can be another push. Perhaps that is what has led the Philippines in the last 2 years to understand that the gap between them and their Asian neighbors will just continue to grow unless they could put in infrastructure to make their country competitive. And the main impediment to building the country's infrastructure? Corruption. And corruption is what Aquino tackled when he first came into office, taking an entire year to redo the government concessioning and contracting processes to reduce the chances for corruption. In the last 2 years, the stock market has gone up 72% in the Philippines. And it is the only country where the projections for GDP growth have been revised up in the region. This sense of competition is the key to the success of the World Bank's product that many of you might know called the Ease of Doing Business Index. This actually is a world-changing index, and some say actually the most successful product the World Bank has ever had beyond the billions of dollars that it's lent. It measures just a few things, but these things are what a country can do. Which countries have the most and the least red tape that get in the way of companies getting things done. It measures a few simple things like days to enforce a contract, days and cost to set up a new business, days and cost to wind up a company, etc. We now find countries competing with each other to remove obstacles to private sector companies getting things done. Saudi Arabia's ambition and focus have allowed it to climb to number 12 out of the 183 countries in the ranking from the middle of the pack in 2004. The second thing, besides this push that is necessary, is committed leadership with vision. Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore comes to mind the fastest here. He saw an opportunity in his small city-state and perhaps the threat of continued poverty, and took enormous initiatives to create and execute an entirely new business model for a country. Part of leadership is creating and communicating this compelling vision of the way things can be or should be, and one hopes persuading the relevant population that the vision is right. Number 3 is a building of institutions around the vision of the leadership, or perhaps even around the consensus of the country. As Darren Ajamolu and James Robinson explore in How Nations Fail, which many of you might have read recently, it is politically supported institutions which make or break the ability of a country to provide economic opportunity to its citizens. I believe Lebanon had its own experience with a serious attempt to do this when your former president, Fouad Chaheb, built what was called Dawlat al-Muassasat, a nation of institutions. In order to reinforce institutions, which may be at the heart of developing and progressing a culture, I believe one needs 2 more things, so maybe number 4 and 5, but under the topic of institutions. One of those is enforcement. I travel all over the emerging markets nearly all the time, as my husband can attest. Generally, the laws are okay. They're pretty good. Sometimes there's a bad law, but generally they're pretty good. Most of the laws in the emerging markets are based on either French civil code or English common law. They're not bad. But enforcement is terrible and damagingly absent. The other is communication, preferably 2-way communication that sets up a dynamic of accountability for the institution. Building support for the institutions among the population or the groups affected is the best way to ensure that the institution survives. But the rationale for it needs to be at least understood and at best agreed to. One of the best examples of how policy can change culture is the case of Poland. In the 1980s, Poland was widely viewed as a corrupt country, and it had the laziest workers in Europe. In Germany, at that time, if a parent wanted to scold a child, for having a messy room, she would say, "Your room looks like the Polish economy." And I am also embarrassed to say that growing up as a child, we told Polish jokes. Now flash forward to today. Today, Poland is seen as a safe place for people without political connections to do business, and it is said to have the hardest working people in Europe. How did this happen? First, there was an enormous external shock when communism fell and the Berlin Wall was torn down. Second, there was a strong leader who was willing to take hard decisions and even sacrifice his own political career to make reforms. This was Leszek Balcerowicz. He was a PhD economist who also had an MBA from the United States. He became an economic advisor to Solidarity in the late 1980s. After the fall of communism, he was Minister of Finance of Poland from 1989 to 1991, critical years. As he put it in an interview, this was years later, he did the interview, quote, "Reform is hard. Coal miners were at the top socially because communism is wasteful and needs a lot of energy. There was no use for marketers because the issue was supply, not demand. In a reformed economy, on top were bankers and IT specialists and lawyers and specialty accountants. It changes the social dynamic," end quote. But he pushed through the reforms to transform Poland into a market economy despite the upheaval in the normal cultural order. The economy he inherited was plagued by hyperinflation and massive shortages. As he put it years later, what he did was set out to build institutions: the central bank, the stock exchange, and privatized companies. He was in fact criticized for privatizing too slowly at the time, but Poland was in fact still corrupt, and he did not believe he could privatize on a large scale until corruption ameliorated. And if you compare the Polish and Russian experience on this, perhaps he was right. He did risk his career, in fact became a scapegoat for someone to blame for the disruptions. It is possible that this in fact was a failure of either communication or persuasion on his part. But while vindication was slow, he did come back as chairman of the National Bank of Poland in the year 2000. Since 1989, Poland has had the best consistent growth of the post-communist countries and has not gone into recession. And its corruption levels are close to that of Denmark, Germany, and other Western European countries. In addition to experiencing three big conditions for change, shocking event, strong leader, and good institutions, Poland also had the incentive of European accession. If they would harmonize their laws and enforcement of their laws, they would be able to become part of the EU with its large free trade zone. So this had the positive attraction of access to markets and also allowed them to slip out of Russia's orbit structurally and perhaps permanently. They acceded to the EU in 2003, where they had to meet the Copenhagen criteria that included, literally it's written, achieving stable institutions that guarantee democracy, legality, human rights, and respect for and protection of minorities. Again, these are institutions. In fact, other than the sweeping reforms in China from 1979 to 2002, and yes, I do believe that they halted or slowed down in 2002, EU accession was probably the most important leap forward in economic development we have ever seen. Acceding to the EU allowed 10 formerly communist countries to make wholesale changes in the policy environment, which put millions of people into productive work and thereby into the middle class. And I might add that Turkey's leaders used the concept that they might accede to the EU to actually reform their economy as well. Poland is a transformed country due to the factors I have listed, but also due to reasonably good enforcement of the regulations that support the newly built institutions. Their tax collection is reasonable, securities laws are enforced, and nobody has to bribe a policeman. So were the Poles in the 1980s the laziest workers in Europe? And how did they become the hardest working people in Europe? I would posit that it is simply intellectually lazy to say that any class of people are lazy, per se. They had the worst possible work incentives under communism. The incentive system actually can be summed up in the old communist joke. I will pretend to work and you will pretend to pay me. I thought of this dynamic of the intellectual laziness, not of the pretending to be paid. Recently, when I was talking to an American friend after the incidents of the film trailer in the Middle East, I said I believed it was incumbent on Americans to explain to the Arab world and others why Americans are so absolutist in their protection of free speech. And I was stunned when he said to me, "Oh, we can't explain it, it's cultural." Of course we can explain it. It's just lazy to say it's cultural. With enough work, a constitutional lawyer, a historian, and a sociologist could tease out all the threads and, in fact, explain it quite exactly why Americans believe in free speech rights with so few restrictions. Another example of the mutability of productive culture is Korea. In 1954, a World Bank report found that Korea had no future. When people spoke of Korea time, it meant one would be late, like saying mañana in Latin America or bukura in the Middle East. But a strong man leader, President Park Chung-hee, changed that. During the 1970s, this authoritarian president took Korea into an era of export-led industrialization based on government and private sector cooperation. This alliance led to the development of the famous Korean chaebols, that is, private conglomerates. He set up a system that was pretty unique, where the government got together with different sectors on a regular basis and would say to one exporter, "Great, you overfilled your export quota, your interest rate will be 5%. You bad exporter, you didn't fulfill your quota, your interest rate is going to be 12%. And it was highly effective for providing a lot of incentives for these people to export. It also made them highly leveraged, which became their downfall in the Asia financial crisis. But the legacy of manufacturing excellence, innovation and design, and the enormous focus on education initiated by President Park, while quite coercive, has indeed created a culture that is now the opposite of that referred to as Korea time. The Asia crisis actually became a turning point for Korean companies. Before that, boards of directors rarely met, and they certainly rarely fulfilled their function of monitoring management. The controlling families made all the decisions, and when they needed other board members to sign for regulatory reasons, they had an automatic pen machine to just give them those signatures. But in the painful deleveraging of the chaebols, they now had to become subject to actual corporate governance criteria. And in the 2000s, Korea had its first shareholder lawsuit, which was brought against Samsung by a friend of Dr. Saeedi's, I'm sure. It was also a successful lawsuit, much to the shock of the business community and the delight of the nascent investor community. That was, in fact, the first shareholder suit that I know of in the emerging markets. And the most positive thing about this is cementing the institution of the judiciary in Korea. Still not perfect, but it at least is something. And at one point it was thought that those cultures derived from Confucianism would never develop because they did not value hard work and were corruptly hierarchical. Max Weber, in his book, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, singled out two cultures in particular that were prone to poverty and stagnation: Japan and China. They were never going to make it. And now China is building a network of Confucius centers outside China to rival the Alliance Française and Goethe Institutes to promote Chinese values of discipline and hard work and the learning of Mandarin, a language named after the traditional Chinese scholar bureaucrats who did not get their very long fingernails dirty. One of the insights I had in researching this speech was that much of the old work done in culture and economic development just turned out to be wrong. Not only Max Weber, who died in 1920, so one maybe can forgive him, but also recent writers who talk, for example, about the miracles of Spain and Portugal. According to Fareed Zakaria, most people still believe that two cultures in particular inhibit economic development, African and Islamic. But which are the two countries next in line to make it to the $1 trillion mark in GDP? Both Muslim democracies, Turkey and Indonesia. And 7 of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world are African. In a world of constant change and new policy vigor, holding on to a fixed view of culture and of the primacy of culture in determining policy means you will miss its changing dynamics. So the role of culture in national policy and the extent to which culture can be changed and the extent to which one should want to change it is fraught with arguments about values and religious beliefs, arguments about the contributory elements of geography and soil and climate, arguments about the imposition of outside values on local people. It's really enough to give you a migraine. But that's why it's refreshing to turn to the world of corporations. Each corporation, whether it has mindfully created it or not, has a culture. Indeed, corporations may make better test subjects for examining the importance and changeability of culture. It is impossible to say a company does not have a culture. One can only ask, does it have the best culture for its objectives? And the main mechanism by which culture is maintained, strengthened, eroded, or warped is what we call corporate governance. Corporate governance is a set of policies, procedures, and practices that are articulated for the company, enforced by the institutions within the company, such as the board, the management team, the external auditors, the quarterly financial statements, the internal audit function, etc. It is a corporate governance mechanisms that set up and monitor the incentive system that either encourage adherence to a desirable culture or not. When we think of corporate governance, we think of 4 main elements: the structure and composition and functioning of the board, the treatment of minority shareholders and other outsiders, such as creditors, the system of control, and transparency and disclosure. To put this in the language of national policy, the board of directors represents the leadership and vision needed to create and maintain a conducive culture. The treatment of minority shareholders and creditors is proof of the integrity of the contract between the controlling parties and others. The control systems are the enforcement mechanisms like the taxmen and police to ensure the rules are followed. And transparency and disclosure is a way to communicate at regular intervals to shareholders and to open the company to the scrutiny of others. And as I find with some family businesses, transparency to others is often a push a company needs to be even transparent to itself. Having to explain to others ensures that the family understands things like product profitability, line of business profitability, for example, and how capital is actually being allocated, and perhaps how employees, including family members, are incentivated. Stories of the creation of corporate culture are plentiful. You probably have some of your own. One of my favorites is the story of Paul ONeill at Alcoa Aluminum Corporation. ONeill's background was actually as a U.S. government bureaucrat working in the national budget. He moved to the private sector and eventually became vice president of International Paper Company. But he was asked by the board of directors to take over Alcoa in 1987. They had $1.5 billion in revenue, so not terribly large. He studied the company very thoroughly before agreeing to take over. He only wanted the job if he could figure out what would be the key object of his focus. So when he became CEO, he met with Wall Street securities analysts in a ballroom in a New York City hotel. And he told them, and I quote, "I intend to make Alcoa the safest company in America. I intend to go for 0 injuries." Even when he was asked questions about inventories, capital ratios, he said, profits didn't matter as much as safety. So the analysts raced out of their offices to run and put sell orders on the company since Alcoa's board had gone nuts and put a crazy hippie in charge. And it was universal. I believe the stock fell 25% in the first couple weeks. The management team at Alcoa started to analyze the trajectory of accidents, their causes, the complications that exacerbated them. They put in place safety training, physical barriers, automatic shutoffs for equipment, and a host of things that would prevent accidents from recurring. They solicited safety suggestions from the workers, kind of as Mr. Makhzoumi was saying earlier. And ONeill wrote a note to every worker. He told them, call me at home if your managers are not following up on your safety suggestions. He told a reporter, workers started calling, but they didn't want to talk about accidents. They wanted to talk about all these other great ideas. So one example he gave is that workers said they were never good at guessing what color people would want in aluminum siding. So the worker who's talking to ONeill on the phone says, if we group all our painting machines together, then we can switch out the color pigments faster, and we can be more nimble at responding to shifts in customer demand. We don't need to know what they are. So ONeill demanded very importantly that he be told about any accident anywhere in 340 Alcoa locations in 43 countries within 24 hours. This led to hugely improved communications between workers and their managers, and their managers to vice presidents and vice presidents to ONeill. This mandate was institutionalized in a communication system that included the early adoption of electronic mail in 1991. Of course, the students here don't know a world without email, but the World Wide Web did not even exist at this time. This email system gave huge advantages in collecting intelligence, improving their sourcing, buying, product specifications, floor layouts, a whole host of things. In the first 5 years, lost work days and disabling injuries fell by 50%. And hourly employees enrolled in the financial incentive programs went from 5% to 50%. When he retired in the year 2000, market capitalization of the company had risen by $27 billion, and net profits were 5 times higher. Accident rates were also 5% of the level of the industry as a whole, and all those security analysts were dead wrong, as many of them admitted later. The board had not hired him due to a crisis, but because they saw an opportunity. They supported his focus and were amenable to building the major control systems in the company around worker safety, which became the backbone around which other systems could be built. This, like most stories of cultural change, is a story of an opportunity or threat, leadership, institutions, communication, and enforcement. One tricky question for the corporate governance community is the extent to which the board should direct corporate culture. Research is very powerful in showing that corporate culture matters enormously to a firm's profitability, flexibility, and ability to deal with crisis and change. As the ex-CEO of a US company at a seminar said recently, your corporate culture runs the business 90% of the time, especially when you're not there. Most people would agree that tone at the top is very powerful, but reasonable people can differ about whether the top should refer to the board or to the senior management. In my experience, I have rarely seen a cultural change start with the board unless the chairman is also the CEO, or it is a family board with high consensus. The molding of culture is simply too time and attention consuming to be effectively done at the board level. What we find most frequently is the board hires a CEO capable of shaping the best culture for what it is they want to do. And as the board reviews financial performance, strategy, production, compensation, HR policies, etc., they should also review how the culture is being reinforced in all these elements. Board members should be able to assess the living culture of the firm. They can visit plants, they can commission attitude surveys, they can talk to executives. As one director put it, if a director thinks he cannot find out what the culture is, he is in denial. It's also important for the board to use the other elements of governance to reinforce the CEO's efforts to maintain or change a culture. The fair treatment of minority shareholders can be a cultural trait. There are companies we know of, I've been around a long time, where the controlling shareholders regularly engage in asset stripping or using company workers or contracts for their own private projects, or self-dealing or over or under invoicing, and other dirty tricks which we call asymmetric benefits from the company. But if the ethical framework of the company is robust and is reinforced through the internal controls and audit system, in other words, the institutions, this will go a long way to reducing such behavior. And if it is part of the culture, then it will be communicated to every part of the company, and someone trying to take asymmetric benefits will have no one to help them, no accomplices. Given that over half of the listed companies in the emerging markets where I invest are family companies, the role of family company boards interests me enormously. And one Arab company is particularly fascinating. It's the Majid Al Futtaim Group, called MAF, in Dubai. You will know it because it famously owns the Emirates Mall that has a ski slope in it. It is also the most successful of Carrefour's local partners in its regional hypermarket franchise. The founder and sole shareholder, Majid Al Futtaim, does not work in the company and has no family members working in the company. So after experimenting with other approaches, he basically set up state-of-the-art corporate governance mechanisms in the group. Amale. There's a board at the holding company level that's composed of highly respected and experienced directors from all over the world. So, for example, the UK director is also the chairman of British Telecom and EasyJet, and the deputy chairman of Barclays Bank. The fellow from Singapore is also a director of Standard Chartered Bank. Until he was made central bank governor, the Saudi on the board headed Morgan Stanley in the kingdom. So likewise, each of the subsidiaries has a formal and highly experienced board, and the sole shareholder is not on any board. The holding company board holds its subsidiaries accountable and is continually making allocation and funding decisions. The staff actually are very happy with the situation. The role of the board is very clear. It puts in place processes, audits, and compensation policies. Nothing is done at the whim of the owner. There's no glass ceiling because there are no family members to take the top jobs. And the company may be more transparent than any listed company in the country. And it's worth mentioning also that the company issues bonds, and so one could say that their regulator, so to speak, is the credit rating agencies. So like most of us, they have a boss. Turning to Lebanon, I am absolutely no expert, and it is an understatement to say that my ignorance is vast. So please forgive me. And I have not even been here personally since the Civil War. But what I want to know is, why does everyone else tell me that the best governed enterprises and perhaps the best firms in Lebanon are the banks? From what I can tell, one plank is the institution of the central bank, which is seen by most observers to regulate consistently, reasonably, fairly, and importantly, independently. It is clear about what it expects and meets frequently with the Bankers Association to communicate its policies and its concerns. In addition, it has the full power and ability with the Banking Control Commission to enforce its regulations. This does two things. It enhances its credibility, but it also ensures that it is not only responsible, but also accountable. With the independent powers it has, who else would be accountable for regulating the sector? And therefore, I imagine from time to time it has to take its lumps with the occasional bank closure. Some of the research on the social dynamics of corporate governance by Bruce Kogat and others tells us that governance is exercised through powerful informal networks of owners, directors, and managers. I imagine that sounds a little familiar to people in Lebanon. In the small world of Beirut's elite bankers, it's easy to posit that social suasion is part of the incentive mechanism for good governance among this group, who are, after all, seeing each other at the Bankers Association with some frequency. Banks in Lebanon are mostly family-owned, like most companies in the world and like most listed companies in the emerging markets. The most often cited source of difference that, from my asking people, is that banks all have outside directors on their boards. Recent research shows that each additional family member on the board, and this is for listed companies, is associated with a drop in return on assets of 0.85 percentage points versus true independents with a neutral control group. This compares with each family nominated director, where the drop in ROA is a less significant 55 basis points. And the negative relationship between family members, directors, and firm performance worsens with each generation of family members and is most pronounced when families hold a higher proportion of board seats than their ownership position would warrant. In addition to not loading the board up with family members and family proxies, the banks seem to follow the three characteristics that we at our firm Cardica like to see in family businesses. First, we like that family control is clear. It may not be 51%, it may be just a controlling block, but we like having a family that we really know is going to be responsible and care deeply about the company, and that the levers of control are there that reinforce their commitment to the business and ensure and promote clarity. Number two, we like them to be listed on the stock exchange. But if they're not listed, having formality, discipline, and disclosure as a proxy for that can be extremely important. For example, if records need to be kept as if an outsider might audit them, then you can have a lot of transparency and clarity. Promotion and bonus criteria should be articulated for all employees so they know if they work hard, they can be promoted and achieve a bonus. And the third thing is professionalism. So either professionally qualified family member, which is the case in a number of the companies that we invest in, or an outside professional. This seems to be the case for Lebanese banks, and of course, Lebanon is renowned for having some of the best bankers in the world, and I know because they are scattered all over the world, and I meet them in all far-flung corners of the world. I'm always delighted when I do. Governance literature also shows that when there is a cohesive category of employers in a country, this can enhance professionalism. That is got to be the case with banking in Lebanon. It is a cohesive set of employers, and there's a uniformly high expectation of employees who work in banks, and probably some of the students here will graduate to work in banks. On family business, I have a lot of experience because I've been around a long time, and this is the most prevalent kind of business anywhere in the world. What we look for in investing in family companies is precisely those elements that Lebanese banks appear to have. But a lot of success will depend on whether the family wants to impose its own family culture on the business or to create a separate, distinct culture for that business. I think it's fair to ask whether Rupert Murdoch, in fact, overlaid his own family culture on top of the vast 53,000-person global corporation instead of the culture that was best for running an empire of media properties. It's customary for all media companies to have a code of journalistic ethics, but News Corp has no statement of ethics, no code of ethics that everyone signs, and as far as we know, ethics was never discussed at the board. That's in contradistinction to the New York Times company, which said, we refuse to own any TV or radio property because those are regulated by the government, and we don't want to be in a situation where we have to appeal to the government to renew a license because we want to be entirely independent. Of course, Rupert Murdoch is known to be a frequent visitor at 10 Downing Street, so perhaps the opposite of that. It's rare for a successful company to have the cultural attributes one might find in a lot of families. Not every family, but a lot of families. For example, a family might have a culture of playful infighting, or a culture of conflict avoidance, or a culture of encouraging social interactions only with one's own religious group, or a culture of respect for the past. That might be found in families. But successful companies are more likely to promote incentives for cooperation among employees, to provide forums for honest discussions of different points of view, to hire people of various groups so that they get a complementary skill mix, and to embrace creative destruction when it is the best path for future growth. On this last point, research shows that family businesses do worse in general than independent businesses on creative destruction. Randall Mork found that family companies tend to underinvest in research and development, and older families tend to invest even less. And wealthy families tend to suppress innovation to preserve the value of their existing assets, even at the risk of them becoming worthless over time. But family businesses are the backbone of nearly every economy. In order to develop an economy to its full potential, those need to be run as efficiently, as profitably, and therefore sustainably as possible. And because culture runs your business 90% of the time, we would like to see all businesses use the principles of transparency, combined with leadership, institutionalization of good practices, communication of values, and enforcement of the best behavioral characteristics to nurture the most functional cultures they can. I have been told that people here in Lebanon don't feel protected by their institutions, but feel protected by their politics. When I hear this, I wonder why everyone doesn't feel equally protected by the institutions of the police, the judiciary, and the democratic process. But since Lebanon is so complex in its economic and confessional history, I am going to be lazy and say it's cultural. But I hope you who know the country and can parse out all its moving parts are not so lazy and will take up the task. Ashkurakum, many thanks.
We'll show the movie in a little bit. Why don't we dim the light, please?
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Rami, Makhzoumi, and I were at school together in London and became best friends and companions. I've worked at Future Pipe Industries, the Makhzoumi family business, the past 10 years. When Rami died so suddenly in April of last year, it became a priority for his family and those close to him to try to document his life story so that others could learn and benefit from all that he had achieved. Shortly thereafter, we approached his old professor from London Business School to write Rami's business biography. Professor Stephen Sonsino was already a successful author, and he teamed up with his wife, Jacqueline Moore, an ex-Financial Times journalist, to research and write this book. In the past, Stephen had been engaged by Rami as a consultant and was involved in several strategic projects at Future Pipe. This put him in a unique position to author this biography. He knew Rami well, and he knew the business well. Stephen once told the management team at Future Pipe that leadership is what happens when you leave the room. At Future Pipe today, the spirit of Rami's leadership endures and will continue to endure as we work to implement the initiatives that he envisioned. Initiatives that will help place best practices, good governance, ethics, and transparency at the heart of everything that Future Pipe does. This biography will ensure that Rami's message is available to whoever wants to learn more about what he achieved and what influenced him to become the remarkable human being that he was. And when they get a little bit older, it will also give his young daughters an opportunity to better understand why their father was so inspirational and so universally loved. The book that we are launching today, The CEO's Journey, has taken over a year to complete and is the product of over 70 interviews with family members, friends, colleagues, suppliers, and customers who knew Rami well. It is an honest, true, and independent account of Rami's life. Unfortunately, Stephen could not be here today, but we will now show you a short video that Stephen prepared a few days ago in London for this event. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Stephen Sonsino. I'm sorry I can't be with you today as you launch CEO's Journey, the book that my wife Jackie and I have been writing. over the past year, since I was last at AUB a year ago. Many of you have shared your stories of Rami, and we've tried to include as many of those as we can in this book. Of course, it's not a blow-by-blow account of his life and all of the fantastic things that he did, but we hope it gives you an impression. It's rather like an impressionist painting of Rami and his life. On the other side of this building, there's a statue, and it haunts me. And I remember showing it to Rami once when we were taking coffee in the quad. The statue's called Listening to History. And what haunts me about it is that this man, I think it's a man, so clearly with this book bound to his head, listening to history, he's so tightly listening to the past that he's blind to the possibilities of the future. And one of the things that Rami was passionate about was the future. I personally will be spending as much time as I can spreading Rami's message with as many people who will listen to me. I'd like your help. Perhaps if you read the book and you too are inspired to share his story with others, perhaps you gift your copy of the book to others to let them share in his story. Very soon the book will be on Amazon. Please urge as many people as you can to go and register their interest and perhaps get their own copy of the book. Please take part in the discussions on the Facebook page that is associated with Rami and his legacy moving forward. And please, change the world. It was a joke that Rami and I shared here at London Business School and for many years afterwards. Change the world. I think if he felt that as a result of his passing, if there were people carrying his message forward, I think he would be pleased. I'd like to thank Fuad and May, you both, for entrusting us with this important task to try to capture Rami's biography as best we can. We hope we've done your wishes justice. To May, Yasmin and Noor, I look forward to seeing you again and to sharing some more stories of my little time with Rami with you when you have some time. Also want to say thank you, Saif Alwan, to you. And without your help and liaison between all the different people involved in this immense project, this book would not have seen the light of day. Thank you, Saif. I want to play you a short film that I made a couple of years ago. It's based on a video that Apple made as an advert. It's called Think Different.
Here's to the crazy ones, the misfits, the rebels, the troublemakers, the round pegs in the square holes, the ones who see things differently. They're not fond of rules, and they have no respect for the status quo. You can quote them, disagree with them, glorify or vilify them, but the only thing you can't do is ignore them, because they change things. They push the human race forward. And while some may see them as the crazy ones, we see genius. Because the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do.
Thank you. That ends our lecture series tonight. Please join us for the reception outside.